Okay, hold on 1 second. Yes, of course. I am just updating some information. So, you may be interested in, tonight we're going to look at spring joints, and it's one of my favorites because I am really a big fan of what is known as the hook shot. It was in, I can't remember which. I think it shows up in multiple Zelda games. Link gets this hook shot, which is just an amazing tool, weapon sort of thing, where he can kind of point at an item, and it will hook to it and allow him to swing from that item, that thing, that position. So here's what we're going to sort of create here. So here's our little character who's kind of Linkish, and he will point with the mouse at these boxes up here, these blocks that are in the sky, and he will shoot a little arrow hook thing. I didn't do much in the way of graphics for it, but and he can kind of go between these things. You'll see he gets a little more momentum the further ones he goes from, and he can drop down if I let go of the mouse. And yeah, he can make his way across. If there's like lava here, or well, let's see, maybe he can't. One way or another, he can't walk across here. I have this walking sort of disabled at the moment. So he's not able to kind of do his normal walking around, but he's able to do his hook shotting. So how does that work? What are spring joints around? Okay, so let's look at the hero here. The hero has on it, him, her, it, she, they, a couple of extra things. It has a spring joint, and it has this line renderer. Now, of course, it already had a rigid body and a circle collider and so on, but the two new things it added are this spring joint and the line renderer. Now, the line renderer I'm just using to kind of create this line on the fly, so you kind of visualize what the hook shot is doing. And right, woo! And I'll show how it's basically set up that by default, it's just a line renderer with two positions in it, and the initial and ultimate length of the line is set pretty. If I crank that up, watch what happens. It shoots this big line, and I just want this tiny little line kind of thing. So you can adjust that, and it's just recalculating the position of where the line is going from and to, and it's doing that in code. So here we have the the line renderer has two endpoints, and that's all there is to it. So line render is kind of a fun little thing to use. You'll notice it does turn itself off. I can use the right mouse button to kind of drop, and the left mouse button shoots, and I can shoot down there, get myself back to the ground, and so on. Okay, so then there is the spring joint. Now, there's also a hookshot script, which is important. But so let's look at the spring joint. What the spring joint does is basically a spring joint. Normally it will have a position. So we'll go down here. Let's look in the scene view here. And you'll see if I select the hero and we turn on this spring joint, you'll see that the spring joint has a location that it's going to be anchored to, the connected anchor. Move that around here. So say it's over here, something like that. The connected anchor, which is where we want to have it emanate from. And then we have the anchor, which is at 0, 0 on the originating game object. So it's at 0, 0 in our little character here. If we wanted it to be, say top of his head or something like that, then it could be up there. And it also has a target distance. So this distance is 2, which is this distance it wants to be from where it winds up. So this distance along here, you'll notice if I put it sideways, it would be about 2, right? So that's the distance it wants to stay away from this thing when it settles. Okay, so if I start it up, you can see it brought it up there, and now it's just sort of dangling until it kind of relaxes. And so I could change this distance. All right, set it back to 2. I can say how quickly does it dampen. If it doesn't dampen at all, it will wind up, spring around forever. If I wanted to dampen very quickly, I could set it up to 10, and then it would dampen right out. So let's see, let's try that. Or 1 is the highest, I guess, yeah. So it's dampen pretty quickly. If I set the 0.01, 0.01, well, because he's kind of heavy, I think it's not having as much of an effect as it normally would. So we'll just go ahead and leave that to where it was 2. The damping ratio, if I hover here, it will tell us. I take it out of gameplay mode. The damping ratio for the oscillation whilst trying to achieve the specified distance. 0 means no damping, 1 means critical damping. So it will, if we set it to 1, it will try to dampen right away. Let's see, 1. And so dampening ratio of 1 is going to be sort of the most rigid. So it's going to become sort of less like a spring and more just like a hinge joint kind of up there. Okay, so that is our joint setup. Okay. Then to make it really work, so I could attach it to any particular thing, but I don't want it to just be attached to one thing. I'm using it very dynamically in this case, right? So I'll come over here, and for starters, I'll just click the right mouse button, detach it. I can connect it again to a Spider-Man sort of thing. And you'll see he doesn't swing too much in there. Let's see if I can change this again. So if we went to that 0.1, and he swings a little bit more because of that. All right, so how does that work? How does this dynamically change things? So I have this hookshot script, which is not super complicated. So like most scripts, I like to write fairly concise scripts, and we'll comment through here. So this is all in the update routine. So what I want to keep track of is, first off, I have endpoint, which is going to be a mouse target point for the hookshot. Right? That's the target I want to swing from. Okay? So the first thing I do is I always reset one endpoint of the line to the character, right? So one endpoint of that line is going to be at the character, and that's going to be dynamically updated. So even if I'm not shooting, I need to change the end of that. So once it's being rendered, once I'm hanging on something, I need to keep changing that. So actually I'm changing that all the time in update. So every time through here, that gets changed. But now I've got some decisions to make based on input. I say, okay, if if the user presses the fire button, meaning they want to shoot the hookshot at a particular item or somewhere in space even, right? They want to shoot it somewhere. What I do is I find the mouse position. I set endpoint to be the mouse position. And then I convert the mouse position from a screen point to a world point, right? Anytime I'm using the mouse, that comes back in pixels on the screen, so I have to convert that to my world coordinate system. Okay, so that gives me this new M point, this new point in the world. All right, so I'll say translate mouse position to point in world. Okay, and here is get mouse position, and here is if left mouse button pressed. Okay, so we're commenting as we go. All right. Next, I check for I use physics 2D overlap circles. So check for colliders at the target. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm say, okay, at the target position, go into the scene and see, are there any colliders that will overlap at that circle with a very tight radius, 0.1, fairly tight. So a small circle. Are there any colliders in that area? Now I've used that before, spawning enemies and stuff like that. And Physics 2D overlap circle is a very, very useful function. I used to use raycast for this, but you can use this as well. The one thing that this does not take into account here, and I'll leave that up to you if you want to see it, is if there were objects in the way, right? It's just going to find this position and say, okay, that's where I want to shoot. What I should really do, I should use a line cast to then say, okay, between the player and that box, cast a line between the two to see, are there any things in the way? And that should be the thing I actually hookshot to. So this is sort of a simplified version of that. So it will not deal with things that are in the way. So that's the one caveat there. All right, so it assumes if it found anything, if it was able to find an object with a collider, or found a collider at the point which I clicked, I'm going to enable the spring joint. Okay, I enable the spring joint and set joints connected anchor to the mouse position. Okay, so that becomes the new point that spring is going to be put at. Okay, that's going to be the pivot point for the spring. I also turn on the rendering of the line, of the chain, or we call it the rope. Looks more like rope than a chain. Turn on the rendering of the rope, and this is just something that doesn't really matter, just for debug purposes, dolphins. And last but not least, I set the endpoint of the rendered rope to the target. Okay, so now my rope goes from the character to the target. I render it, I connect to the mouse position, and that's all I need to do. Now it's active, and it's going to pull the player to be whatever distance that was set up there. And let's see, next, what I also do is I say, okay, else if fire 2, if the user presses the right mouse button, and in that case, I disable the spring, and I turn off rendering, off rope rendering, and I'm done. Okay, so this is when I release, when I am no longer using my hook shot there, and this is connecting the hook shot. And then the continuous rendering, this handles the continuous rendering of the rope, changing its new position. And the spring joint itself is what really draws me up to there and handles the swinging part. Right? Pretty cool. Now you'll notice, here's one thing. If you're ever using a tile map with a joint, there's a weird thing that can happen. I'm going to put my player, I'm going to move my player down here, and I'm going to hit play. Now, you'll notice he's kind of stuck under there, which is funny, but let's move the camera here so that we can sort of see him under there. Okay. And it works. It works like we would want it to, because we have set it up so that there's a tile map collider on here. All right. Now, normally when you're using hinge joints, you decide, okay, does the player collide with things? Now you notice the player has been colliding with things up there, and oops, let go. Let's put the player back up top momentarily here. Put him up here, and we'll hit play, and it hits these blocks. So even if he's swinging around, you'll notice he like bonked his head on that block there. Right, hit the block. So it has some interactions with the block there. But let's turn off enable collision here. Now everything still works normally, and it actually does do those collisions here because it isn't the joint that's causing, it's not, this joint isn't hinged, it's not connected. You'll notice connected rigid body. There is no connected rigid body. I'm just connecting it to a location in the world. If I'd connected it to one of these objects, then I would select that to make sure that it would not ignore that collision, right? So if I really connected it to there, I'd have to enable that collision, right? So for example, if I come down here and I say, okay, which cube? Let's select one of the cubes here. Cube, cube, cube. Which cube? Cube. Not that cube. Not that cube. This cube. All right, that cube. And I go to the hero, and I want to connect that cube there, right? So now it knows that that is supposed to be the connected rigid body. It's not just the position, it is the connected rigid body. And everything gets a little bit weird at that point. So let's see. If we go ahead and we set that, and we want it to, let's see, hero, and we will, even if we set these to 0, 0, because of this connection here, it's going to do some odd things. You notice that this body moved in relationship there. See, there's some interesting connections between these two things once we do that, right? Oops, I just connected. Connected wrong side. That side up there, and that's where the player is going to be if I reset that. Alright, that's one part of it. Now, if we push this back onto the center of the player, we pull him. It's going to try to pull him up there, but gravity, his own mass, is working against him. It's a little weird scenario. Okay, so we're eventually going to get up there. But you'll notice that he is affecting this even because of the joint, right? Because it's connected to that rigid body. And because it's connected, it's not going to collide with it unless this collision is set true, right? So up here, eventually, you'll see that, let's see, maybe if I just move him. Well, he did collide with it, so that did work out, even though we didn't have enable collision set here. So yeah, that interaction, usually the collision, this collider, connected rigid body, and enable collision, you'll see, should rigid body connected with this joint collide, right? So should this rigid body that's connected here, connected to this joint, should it collide with it, okay? And that's if that is set. Now, if it's not set, everything will work normally. I will collide with that and other things. But the weird thing that happens is if that's not set, and let's turn this off here so that it is not connected to the cube. Okay. Now it is working just fine. It was acting very buggy before in that what would happen. Oh, I remember. Hold on. Yeah, I got to do this in a certain way. Ready? Okay, now it's acting normal, but watch this. That's acting normal as well. It used to have this problem where sometimes if enable collision wasn't set, the tile map would act odd. Let's see. Wait a minute. Hold on. Oh, okay. First, let's get that, set that back to 0. Or delete that connection there. Okay, sorry, I was in play mode there. All right, so now it's not set. And we will shoot up there and down there. And hero. Okay, enable collision is on. Okay, now I'm not connecting to any particular rigid body here. Let's turn this off. Okay, now so it's touching, it's hinged here, and I let go, and it touches the ground, and that's normal. But watch what happens when I connect. For some reason, the moment I am hinged inside there, I no longer collide with that object, even though I'm not the rigid body that I'm connected to here. So normally I'd have to set this enable collision if this connected rigid body was set, right? Because it says that specifically. Connected rigid body and enable collision should rigid bodies connected with this joint collide. Right? Now certainly the collider that is on this tile map isn't connected to this joint. So it's odd that, see, in this case, things are colliding, just like you normally think they would. But now, that collider becomes disabled the moment that the spring joint is active. So even if I activate it there, and, well, I'd have to set it, watch this, I'll set the length to be 8. Okay, so it's connected up here, but it's refusing to collide until I disable that. In this case, then it pushes it off and stops working, which is... So anyway, if you happen to be using a spring joint and you enable collision, and perhaps it's other joints as well, so we'll leave that aside. Be careful. You may have to enable collisions in order for it to still recognize your collisions with your tile maps. So I think maybe there's some kind of weird thing going on in the Unity engine where tile maps are assumed to be connected to a rigid body or to a hinge even when they're not. So that's a long part. So enjoy trying things out with the hinge joint, if you like, creating yourself a hook shot or some other kind of useful tool or challenge or trap or puzzle. Enjoy.